You're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher and Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Louisa Reeves. She is Director of Policy and Evidence at Speech and Language UK, formerly ICAN. Louisa is a speech and language therapist with 30 years experience of working to support children and young people with speech and language challenges. She has been involved in a number of large-scale projects developing and evaluating tools and programmes for early years settings and schools, and is responsible for the evaluation of the outcomes and impact of all the charity's projects and development work. She also leads on Speech and Language UK's policy work, including developing and implementing the charity's strategies to influence key decision makers and our public affairs work. She has done a variety of media work, including live interviews and broadcasts. Hi, Louisa, how are you?
Hello, Georgina.
Very excited to see you. And for those who are tuning into YouTube, you'll notice Louisa's absolutely brilliant branded background as well, which looks great. So tell me about Speech and Language UK and what support it offers then. Give us a brief overview.
So we're really proud of our new brand. We've just been through a big rebrand because although for many years we had the name of ICAN as a charity, we felt that actually it didn't really mean very much to people and it didn't say what we did. So Speech and Language UK absolutely says what we do.
Yes.
So we exist to support children and young people who are struggling with their talking and understanding words, and that ranges from children who might have kind of short-term challenges to those who will have lifelong speech and language challenges. And we do that in a number of different ways. We make tools and training for schools and early years practitioners. We have two special schools that we run ourselves who support children and young people with very complex needs. We do a lot of work in partnership with other organisations. You mentioned the policy work that I lead on, so we do a lot of pushing for parliamentarians to kind of change practice and to really make sure that everybody understands what speech and language challenges are. So great opportunity to talk to you today about it.
Thank you. That's absolutely fantastic, and I do agree. It is a more Googleable name for your charity. When you type in speech and language charity, obviously it will come up now. Whereas just out of interest, what did ICAN actually stand for originally then?
Well, the charity was established actually by the Victorians in the late 1800s. So it did stand originally for Invalid Children's Aid Nationwide, which now feels very outdated, but was then set up to support very vulnerable children. And we've kept that kind of ethos going over the 100 and whatever years since.
I didn't realise
the name no longer reflected kind of the children and young people that we support. Gosh, I had no idea your charity had such a historic background. That's incredible. It's got very deep roots in the charity sector, yes. And then in the last sort of probably 50-60 years, we've really focused on supporting children with speech and language challenges. So what's your background then, Louisa? What led you to work for Speech and Language UK? It's a very good question. So I trained as a speech and language therapist. I'm still fully qualified and registered speech and language therapist, and I started my career in the NHS, working with children and with adults actually, but recognised that although I could support the individual children that I saw, there was a huge need out there for children who were struggling with talking and with understanding words. And some of those children didn't need the specialist support of a speech and language therapist and could be supported in other ways. And there was just a general lack of awareness amongst parents and teachers, particularly of the challenges that children face and how they could be helped. So I saw an opportunity working for what was then ICAN to kind of spread my expertise and knowledge more broadly, so have had a number of different roles in the charity, really primarily around just making people more aware of the issues that children face, but also what the solutions are. So at Speech and Language UK, we've got a number of solutions that we can train TAs to deliver. We have training available for early years practitioners and for teachers at primary and at secondary, so that they can kind of, use some of the expertise that speech and languages therapists build up to develop, what they do.
That is such a good point, because often you feel like it is the speech and language therapist's job and you don't want to encroach on it, but actually there's a lot you can do in the classroom already, isn't there, that could be helping with communication and speech language, that are small tweaks that you don't necessarily have to have had the full training of being a speech and language therapist to carry out.
Yeah, absolutely. Speech, language and communication is kind of everybody's business, really. So we all talk. Those of us who work in the education profession can, talk quite well. And so everybody's got skills to help. They just sometimes need that knowledge and sometimes a bit of confidence.
Yeah, I would say it is confidence
to know,
a lot of the time.
Yeah, the right way to go. But the other thing I think, Georgina, which is really important to note is, our own research shows that there are about 1.7 million children at the moment who teachers are concerned about in terms of their talking and their understanding of it. And speech and language therapists are quite a small profession. Absolutely. There's no way we're going to be able to support all those children.
No.
And lots of them won't need that very specialist support. But there are a few children who really, really do. And that's a kind of precious resource. My colleagues who work in the NHS now and in the education sector, there aren't very many of them, but for some children they're absolutely vital. So we really want to make sure in Speech and Language UK that we support lots of children where we can, so that scarce resource can be for the few children that really, really need it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And also you don't want the children that could benefit from support in the classroom to be waiting for a speech and language therapy appointment when there's things that could be happening and could help, because if you're waiting, these things don't tend to, they can improve them by support early on. We know that early identification and support is the way forward. So
Absolutely. Yes.
So this is a huge topic to cover in one podcast, but can you summarise for me what speech language communication needs are and how common it is? And am I correct that in a class of 30 you'd expect probably 2 or 3 children to have some sort of lifelong speech language communication needs, which is shocking?
It is, yes, and I think that points to what we've already talked about, the really big numbers of children who struggle, and the fact that that's often not recognised. It's not the first thing that teachers look for. So yes, the roughly 10% of children are likely to have long-term speech, language and communication needs, and that's reinforced by quite a number of research, pieces of research, but in some areas of the country it's actually much bigger than that. So we know from research, but also from the results of the early years foundation stage measures, that actually up to half of children can start school in some areas of the country behind where they need to be in terms of communication and language. So it's quite a significant issue. Speech, language and communication, it's a plunky term, isn't it? It's what we call an umbrella term. So it covers a number of different challenges that children can have. And one of the things that's always interested me in many years of working with these children is that as adults we struggle to understand exactly what the issue is. And I think that's because we all talk and we forget how we learn to talk, because it happens, so many years ago. You can't remember how you did it, can you? Can't remember how you did it, and we don't often sort of think about how we do it. We think we want to say something, we open our mouths, the words come out. So speech, language and communication are 3 different aspects of how we communicate with each other. Speech is really all about the sounds in the words. And those are language specific. So as English speakers, we all babies are born, babbling all the different possible sounds. Gradually that babble changes towards the sounds they hear around them. So if you're an English born into an English speaking family, you hear English sounds. If you're born into a multilingual or bilingual family, you hear lots of more sounds, you have a bigger range. But children, if you think back to your baby's development, they start to babble, then they start first words. Sometimes those first words don't sound quite right. So my middle child is called James. His big sister couldn't do j sounds, so he's called James. That's how. So those sounds are acquired gradually over time. By the time children are around 4, they've got most speech sounds in English, but sounds like r and l and y can take a little bit longer. So you'd often get children around that age will talk about lello instead of yellow. So there's a little bit of a mix there. So those are speech sounds. Some children can have a real problem with developing those speech sounds. So they get a little bit stuck in that stage where perhaps those more fluid sounds like the j and the l and the r don't quite come. Some children just a little bit late to develop those sounds. Some children can have really quite a significant difficulty. So there is something called severe speech sound disorder, which means that children are really hard to understand. And so obviously that brings a lot of frustrations, but also makes it really hard for them to interact with their peer group. So that's speech sounds in a nutshell. It's a bigger topic, but as we haven't got lots of time. So if I then move on to language, when we talk about language, we're really thinking about the way in which we structure a sentence. So in English, we tend to have sort of subject, verb, object rule, so how we put words together into a sentence helps us to do things like describe things, because we can put in some describing words. We can talk about things that have happened in the past and things that are going to happen in the future, and we change the tense, we change the word ending to do that. So language is all about how we understand and decode what sentences we're hearing and how we can convey our own meaning by putting words together into sentences. So that's
a lot going on with that as well, isn't there? There's a lot more you could go into.
Huge amount going on, and you can begin to see as a teacher how that then impacts on things like whether you can write a story or whether you can read and understand what you've read, because you need to have that sentence structure in place to do that.
And I suppose if it's impacting on their understanding of language rather than their expression of language, that might be harder for a teacher to notice, because it's easier to notice if you can't hear them speaking properly. But it's hard to notice if somebody hasn't understood you, because they could just be quiet, then you wouldn't necessarily know they haven't taken that information in.
Absolutely, and quite often that's the bit that flies under the radar for a long time. So in early years settings particularly, a lot of the learning is very experiential. So children are doing activities, they're in groups, they can get by watching what everyone else is doing. As you move into more formal schooling, you might still do that group work, so you can get by kind of looking at what everyone else is doing and going along with it, but that starts to fall down over time. And sometimes that can look like naughtiness. So children who do the wrong thing because they've followed the wrong person, or they haven't quite understood what the teacher said, or it's too long a sentence for them to hold all those different elements. So, blue group, go and find your books and come down and sit over here in the corner. You might get the fact that you're in blue group and you get your book, but then you've wandered off somewhere else. So, that can be naughty. Some of those little meanings in a sentence, like the of don't walk in the corridor, if you don't hear that then you're not necessarily going to understand that that's a don't do it as opposed to a do it. And that should be don't run in the corridor, shouldn't it? But those sorts of things. So you're starting to then see where things can go wrong for children. But it's quite hard sometimes for teachers to spot why that is. And that is one of the reasons why we tend to split up speech and language and communication, to try and pin down what it is that's going wrong. So the third aspect of that is communication, and that's a much broader term, which is really all about the fact that you and I are sitting here because we want to communicate with each other. So you've got some questions, I've got some information, we're having an exchange. We know the rules of that exchange. So I listen to you, I stop, I speak. We can take it in turns. It's always a little bit more awkward on a screen than it is face to face.
That's true.
But we understand those sort of unwritten rules of how we communicate, that it's an exchange between two people or a group of people. There are rules around how we listen, how we share the same topic of conversation. So all of those rules around communication, and some of the children that we see in school will struggle with that. So their speech sounds may be fine. They may speak in very grammatical sentences, but actually their interaction with other people is what they're challenged by. And that's that third area.
And I suppose that makes friendship. Sorry, I suppose I'm not following the rules there by interrupting you, but I was just going to say, I imagine that's why children struggle like with friendships as well, and like social skills if they don't, I suppose not necessarily when they're really little, because children get it wrong when they're little and they interrupt like I just did then. But as they get older, that it becomes more formal, doesn't it? The speech and the conversations and how you interact. And if you're not picking up on cues and realizing how to interact with somebody else in a conversation, it might affect your social skills and your friendships.
Absolutely true. And there's actually a film which Speech and Language UK brought out more recently about a little girl called Darcy who has developmental language disorder, which I think we might get on to today with time. But one of the little clips in that film really brilliantly illustrates that actually the rules, if you look at children playing in the playground, the rules are quite complicated. Even a game of football or a game of tag, you've got to understand how to behave, how to join in, and they're quite subtle. And sometimes if you have a communication difficulty, those subtleties escape you, and so you can do the wrong thing, you can get into trouble. Forming friendships, maintaining friendships is hard, and explaining what's happened. So there can be an incident in the playground, the children who are really good at explaining it will kind of get their word in first, but other children who might struggle a little bit with that might end up kind of carrying the blame for that and not be able to explain it.
And then the frustration is going to add to any behaviour problems as well, isn't it? Because you're going to feel frustrated, that child, if your community, it's not fair, you're not able to get your point across and other people are. And oh gosh, that must be really hard for kids. If we talk then, because that leads us quite nicely into developmental language disorder, because this, when I've been researching this, it's huge, and it's surprising that we don't know much about it in general, when there's so many. Is this right? 7.6% of the population affected, something like that.
It is something like that. Yes. And it is, it's probably the most common disorder that you've never heard of. And we work very hard in Speech and UK, but also there are a number of other organisations who really kind of work to raise awareness. But it is, I think, part of this lack of focus that we have in the education system on spoken language and communication. We get very fixed on reading and writing and maths, but we kind of forget that some children don't start school with the spoken language skills they need to be able to access those skills. And so quite often I think children get misdiagnosed or just missed altogether. So yes, developmental language disorder, great that you can research it now, find out more about it, but it is, it's much more common than lots of other difficulties that children have.
One definitely for people to look up, and the acronym is DLD, isn't it? A lot of the time it's, when I've been looking, it's DLD that
it's DLD, yes, and there's a lot of information out there. Speech and Language UK worked with Whole School Send to produce quite a lot of training and materials.
Brilliant.
Which is hosted on our website. So teacher colleagues who are interested in having a look, do go onto our website and look on the DLD pages. There are some short webinars you can access. There's a sort of guide that you can download with lots of sort of really practical strategies and advice.
Yeah, which is what we need, isn't it? So
yes.
What else can impact on a child's speech language communication then? Presumably the pandemic has impacted it. I know there's been a lot of talk of sort of earlier settings, in particular reception, noticing these changes in the cohorts coming in with their speech language communication needs. Is that what you're seeing, the pandemic affecting
absolutely.
it?
I think it's grown absolutely astronomically under COVID, and there've been a number of different reasons for that. Families found themselves very isolated. There were very few opportunities for babies and toddlers and young children to kind of go out and about, and language and speech and language are not skills that just happen, so most babies will learn to walk as they become toddlers, and it might take some a bit longer, but they'll all get there. But actually learning to talk is something which is an interactive skill, so you need to hear talk around you, you need to have people who talk to you and with you, you need to have lots of experiences to talk about. So those children that had the opportunity to perhaps go out and about, or had parents and siblings at home, actually did quite well in terms of their talking, understanding of words in lockdown, because they had lots of stimulation. Those families that were more isolated, perhaps on their own and not able to get out, we've really seen an impact on them. So young children, as you say, early years, nursery settings are finding that they are concerned about children's communication and language, but also around their sort of personal, social and emotional development, which of course relies on language. So actually those two things are very closely associated. And the other thing I think that in some areas they have picked up on is the sort of physical skills as well, the sort of motor coordination has been affected. But I think for speech and language, we've seen that kind of across the age range. So we know that lots of adolescents felt very isolated in lockdown, and they missed that opportunity to sort of peer group interaction. And that's a way that you kind of hone your language skills, and teenagers quite often have their own sort of language, their own set of words, and that the to and fro that you have with that, they miss that opportunity as well. And so we've seen an impact across the age range.
That's really interesting. So not just the youngest children, it's going to have an impact on everyone in fact. Wow. So how are teachers going to notice then if children in their classroom have speech language communication needs? What, again, we could talk for hours on this, but briefly, what sort of things are they looking for?
Well, very basically, Georgina, what I would say is that if you have a child in your classroom who is struggling and you're not sure why, I would always think about speech and language first. So, what is underpinning whatever difficulty it is? So if it's a behaviour difficulty, if it's an emotional difficulty, if it's a specific difficulty around an aspect of the curriculum, I would encourage teachers to always think, actually, might this be something to do with a speech and language challenge? Is it that actually they're not really understanding what I'm asking them to do? Are they struggling to express themselves? Are they, when I introduce new vocabulary, for example, are they quite slow to pick that up? Do they often get the wrong end of the stick? When I ask them to do something, do they do a bit of it, but then seem to sort of, drift off? All of those sorts of things.
So sort of always having it in your mind as a possibility that could be the reason behind anything really, and behaviour and lack of understanding and all of that sort of stuff. And then if they do think they've got a child who's got speech language communication needs, what do they do? What's the process? Because I presume people know, but not everybody does, and it's hard, isn't it? If you're a teacher listening right now and you're thinking, actually, I don't know, it's embarrassing to ask sometimes, isn't it? Because you feel like you should know. So what should they do?
Well, I mean, the first thing is don't feel embarrassed. Teacher training doesn't cover this.
Nope.
And in our recent survey, we found that about half of teachers who were newly qualified felt that they didn't have adequate preparation in terms of knowing about speech and language. So if you think, oh gosh, I don't know about that, that's not a surprise. We don't know what we've not had the opportunity to learn about. We do have a couple of, there are lots of resources on the Speech and Language UK website, but we've got a couple of tools that are immediately useful for spotting if you're not sure. So there's something called the Progress Checker, which is just an online kind of yes, no answers. It goes from about 0 to about 18, I think, on there. So whatever age child or young person you teach, you can go on there and do a quick spot check.
Brilliant.
We also have a resource called University Speaking, which you can download, and there are sort of different ages for the different key stages there. We have some other tools that are more in depth that you can actually purchase and use, but it, you know, something to get your eye in is the main thing. We've got some posters which are really useful to have in your staff room, just to you know, these are the key areas to look
just
at.
Keep it on people's minds as well, like you say, just have that in the back of the head,
at the forefront of your mind. And I think quite often what happens in areas where speech and language challenges are quite common and children tend to be really quite behind where they need to be with their talking and understanding of words, your eye goes out quite quickly, so you lose sight of where children need to be for their learning. So having something like a poster up in the staff room that you kind of go back to from time to time is very useful. We've got some online training which is free to access. So, you know, if you've got a spot of CPD time that you want to get some really practical ideas, then you know, those are the areas to go and look at.
Fantastic. That's really, really useful. And that was my next question, was all about links and where we can send people. So best place then, we're sending people over to your website. What's the address for your website? Just I'll put it in the show notes as well, but just so people have got it.
Yeah, so it's speechandlanguage.org.uk.
Brilliant.
And it's as I say, there are a wealth of resources on there for parents, but also for educators as well. So any sort of age and stage of child that you're working with, you can have a look on there. I've mentioned that we've got some DLD pages, and they also signpost to kind of other areas that you can get some really useful information and support about DLD specifically, but actually any of those strategies will work for most children who have speech and language challenges in your classroom.
Fantastic. Oh, well, thanks ever so much. You've been brilliant. That's been really, really useful. And I apologise again that we can't cover it in more depth. I know it's a huge topic.
I can always come back.
Absolutely. Well, yes. Please tell us, listeners, if you really enjoyed this and want to find out more, tell us to get Louisa back on. That would be good. And then we can go perhaps in detail into one of these areas, more detail into one of these areas is what I'm trying to say, which would be really, really interesting. So thank you ever so much. That was a really, really useful, what a brilliant guest, and hopefully, even though it's such a huge topic area and we weren't able to cover everything, hopefully it gave you sort of a taster of some speech language communication needs information that was useful. So the relevant resources linked to this episode will be found in the show notes below, so do have a look at those, and links to Speech Language UK is also found below. Thanks again for listening to Send In the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Please subscribe to our channel and spread the word that you're listening. Thank you.